There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. All right, so it seems here like Paul, he's leaving the synagogue on bad terms. And so it seems like he's afraid that they might retaliate, because it's always been these Jewish leaders who haven't believed in Paul's message that have been consistent on persecuting Paul. And so it could be that Paul here, that he's actually thinking about leaving the city of Corinth because of all these troubles. And then God gives Paul a vision in the night, where the first thing that God says to Paul is, "Don't be afraid," which means Paul was afraid, because God only says that to people when they're afraid. And in verse 9, the Greek literally says, "Stop being afraid." And God says, "But speak and do not keep silent," which literally means continue to speak. Don't stop at all. Where Paul here, he probably wants to stop speaking, because it always seems to be getting him into trouble everywhere he goes. And it gets him beat up, and it gets him chased out of town or thrown into prison. And so God's telling Paul something that Paul, he already knows, something that he's always telling other people, but he needs to hear it himself too, because he's no different than anybody else. And so God, he tells Paul, "For I am with you." And that's because it doesn't always feel like God is with you, but he always is. And that's a promise that God has given to all of us who believe, that he will never leave us or forsake us. But this promise, it's only good for true believers who are saved. And that promise is even good if we've forsaken him or we've transgressed and we've sinned against him. He says he will never leave us. But this doesn't apply to fake Christians. So it's not for the tares. It's not for the people who say they're Christian, but they haven't been born again. But it does belong to us. Even though we're described of being this kind of people who are unwise and not very noble, people who aren't very mighty, but we've been called. Okay, so now here with all the threats and all the blasphemies of the Jews, God tells Paul, no one is going to attack you here or hurt you in the city. So this is not going to be like Lystra, where he was stoned, or like Philippi, where he was beaten, where God allowed Paul to suffer. Here in Corinth, Paul is not going to be hurt. So God tells Paul, you keep on speaking, you're not going to be harmed. And then God says something that sounds a little strange, that he has a lot of people in this city, where God, it means that he's calling a lot of the Corinthians, where Paul, he just hasn't met them yet. And so you think, all right, well, so God here is saying that he has a lot of people in Corinth, in this city where everybody's drunk, everybody's in idolatry, and they live in sexual promiscuity. But the truth is that God saves these kind of people. And by God saying that he has a lot of people in the city, it doesn't mean that they're already Christians, but that God knows the people that he's chosen to become his people, the ones that he's going to save to become a part of his church. That God knows them, but Paul doesn't know them yet. So this verse, it implies divine election. And it's like what Jesus said, no man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. And so Paul, he believes God here. And so now he stays for like a year and a half, which is longer than any other city where Paul has ever planted a church up to this time. And then Paul, he actually tells us this himself in 1 Corinthians 2:3, that he was afraid when he came to Corinth, where he says, I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstrations of the Spirit and of power. Where he's also telling us here that he didn't try to talk to them, not in Corinth, he didn't try to talk to them like a philosopher, like he did in Athens, where he didn't have very much fruit for his effort. But everything that Paul preaches to the people in Corinth, it was all things that were revealed to him through the Spirit, and it wasn't taught through Paul's own wisdom. And so this is kind of the way I look at it. You have to be willing to be stupid for Jesus, but you do have to be brave. But it's just speaking God's simple truths, and then you just stand back and you see what God will do with it. But you don't need to be afraid. And then we see here in verse 12 where God makes good on his word to Paul, where it looks like Paul is going to go through it all again, where the Jews, they've been plotting again against Paul, where they now have this new proconsul in the city, who's actually the proconsul over all of Achaia, which is the whole region of this part of Greece where Athens and Corinth are. And so these Jews, they drag Paul before this Gallio. And there's actually an inscription found that says that Gallio was the proconsul around 51 AD. So this is still about the same year that Paul is actually appearing before him. Where this Gallio, he was also the brother of a famous Stoic philosopher whose name was Seneca. And history actually says that this Gallio, that he actually was a very likable guy. And so the Jews here, they're going to try to take advantage of this guy's likability. And now they have Paul standing before his judgment seat. And they've actually found this judgment seat, and it's made out of all blue and white marble. And here, the Jews, what they're going to try to do, which they've been pretty successful in doing so far, they're accusing Paul of breaking the law by what he's teaching. And Paul, he's used to defending himself in these kinds of charges. And up until now, it's always landed him in prison and with a good beating. But God here, he's making good on his word. And before Paul has to open his mouth and defend himself, Gallio, he actually defends Paul because he sees this for what it really is, where Paul, he's not breaking any law. This is just a dispute about Jewish religion. This is just an in-house debate. There is nothing that Paul's doing here that's against Rome. And you have to remember here that Paul, he considers himself a Jew. And Paul, he is also still a Roman citizen. So here you have these Jews, and they're bringing in a Roman citizen before the proconsul without any real criminal charges. So Gallio, he's smart enough to not get into these religious debates where he tells them all to figure it out themselves. And then he has the Jews driven out from around his judgment seat, where what he's actually doing to them is he's having them beaten out of the area with sticks. And so now I have all these Greeks, and they're all excited, and they're mad for what the Jews tried to get away with before their new proconsul. And so now they take a Jew who is actually the ruler of the synagogue. And if you remember, that used to be Krispy Kreme's job. And Crispus, he's probably really glad he became a Christian and he lost that job, or else he would have been the one beaten here. And so these Greeks, in their rage, they beat Sosthenes, who is the new Jewish synagogue leader, the one who replaced Crispus. And this probably was a wake-up call for this Sosthenes, because we'll read about Sosthenes later in Paul's letter of 1 Corinthians, where this Sosthenes, he also became a Christian. And he actually ends up being a traveling companion of Paul. And Gallio, he didn't care that the Greeks beat up Sosthenes because he's not going to get involved in any religious disputes or anything that he doesn't have to deal with. But if Gallio here, if he had taken the Jews' sides in this dispute against Paul, the gospel would have stopped at Corinth. But because Gallio didn't, this gave the Christians a green light. This gave the Christians legitimacy in Corinth. So now, after Paul's 18 months in Corinth, Paul feels like it's time to leave Corinth. And this time, it's actually not because he's being kicked out, where now he's sailing off to Syria. And he takes his housemates with him. He takes along Priscilla and Aquila. And if you notice here, Priscilla's name, it comes first. And Priscilla is put first 4 times when the couple's names are mentioned, which is more times than Aquila's name. So a lot of people, they think that Priscilla was probably the better speaker between the two of them. And if you notice here, we never hear their names being used separately. They're always mentioned as a couple, and we don't hear of a lot of couples like that. So this is rare. And the only couple that I can think of that I remember hearing like that was Ananias and Sapphira. And they really weren't as charming as this couple. And so Paul now, he's wanting to look his best. And so he gets his hair cut up in Cenchreae, which is close to Corinth. But what it really is he's having his head shaved and he's making a Nazirite vow where he's going to take that hair and he's going to offer it in Jerusalem at the temple. And for some people, a shaved head is a good look, but it's not for people like me with big heads. We look better with hair, so I wouldn't really be making any of these Nazirite vows. But Paul taking this vow is showing that Paul is not anti-Jewish and that he still considers himself to be a Jew. But Paul doesn't believe that these types of vows are to be required of Gentiles. But there's nothing wrong with a Jewish believer practicing Jewish ceremonies. So now Paul and his lovely couple, they reach Ephesus. And if you remember, this is the place where Paul probably wanted to go on his first missionary journey. So this is the place where the Holy Spirit had forbid him to go in Asia. And so now he's here and he finally gets into that synagogue where he starts reasoning with the Jews. And they receive Paul. And that synagogue, they actually ask Paul to stay. But Paul, he tells them that he must keep this Passover in Jerusalem. And so I'm going to guess that it's been around 5 years since Paul has been able to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. And it's not called the Passover here, it's just called the feast here. But if it just says the feast, it's always assumed that it's the Passover. And then Paul tells them at the synagogue, and he says it just like the Terminator, he says, I'll be back. And then he adds, if God's willing. And he goes, if God's willing. And then Paul, he leaves his friends, Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. And then Paul, he sails back by himself to Caesarea. Then he goes up to Jerusalem. And it doesn't say much about Paul in Jerusalem. But you know that the Jerusalem church, that it had to be excited to hear about all these things that was going on with Paul and his ministry among the Gentiles. And then in verse 22, it says that Paul returned to Antioch, which is his home church. And this is where the second missionary journey ends, with Paul in Antioch. And Paul, he's been gone now for about 2.5 to 3 years, where all of Paul's missionary journeys, they all start from Antioch, and they also end in Antioch, except for the third missionary journey. So now in verse 22, the second missionary journey ends. And now in verse 23, the third missionary journey begins. And we really don't know how long Paul stayed in Antioch between these two journeys, but it could have been as long as a year.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.